Vera, thank you so much for joining us today here on Message Traffic.
I'm just really pleased to be here. It's a really important time to talk about these kinds of things, I think.
It is. And the thing that I realize is that, particularly when it comes to understanding human rights crises and dealing with refugees, et cetera, here in the United States in particular, those terms, those policies get bogged down in either the noise, there's a lot of ignorance, there's a lot of misconceptions. Let's start with, right now when we talk about the Ukrainian question, we talk about the migration, the refugees, and those that are a term that not a lot of Americans understand, the internally displaced persons.
Right.
What is the difference between migrant, refugee, and internally displaced person, and how does that relate to the situation we're seeing in the Russian-Ukraine war?
I think you're asking really an essential question here, because what we find is that the term refugee has always been burdened with negativity, when in fact this Ukraine crisis with refugees might actually help Americans understand broadly how much suffering refugees go through. A refugee is someone who is displaced from their homeland, their country of origin, their place of, where their village or town is, and they had to leave because of religious or political persecution or war, and they're rushing as fast as they can across an international border. Once you are crossing an international border and you are recognized as somebody who is escaping war or persecution, that is when you become a refugee. Internally displaced people are a particular category that we should worry about, especially in this Ukraine-Russia situation, because those are people, civilians, women, children, elderly, disabled, anyone who has been attacked in their home, their village, is out of basic humanitarian support, is afraid for their lives, and they're rushing somewhere else to survive, but they cannot, because of the circumstances, reach an international border. So they're internal refugees, in essence. They're internally displaced from their homes, but particularly vulnerable. So we have, in the Ukraine situation, refugees that are coming across international borders, internally displaced who are particularly vulnerable because they might still be exposed to shelling and violence by the Russians. And those who are migrants, that's a different category. That really is a category of people who might migrate across a border to seek employment or better opportunities. So really, in this situation, we should talk about refugees and internally displaced.
But before we go into a deep dive into the Ukrainian question, while I've got you on the subject, you are widely regarded as a known expert in human rights policy, human rights law. I want to ask you a question. When we talk about the word refugee, when we talk about migrants, those are words that just get everybody's hair on end on both the left and the right when it comes to the southern border. Is the noise that we hear when it comes to the rhetoric on the border control situation, is that making it harder for Americans to understand how dire the situation is in other places, like what we saw in Libya, Yemen, and now what we see in the Ukraine?
So, I mean, again, a really excellent question, because when a lot of refugees are emerging out of war zones like Syria, like Afghanistan, here in the Albany area where I am, I work very closely with Afghans, Syrians, Iraqi refugees, but also Sudanese in the community, right? So they're not as often welcome in this country. because I think people make assumptions about who they are, what they represent, and that, there are biases against people. And here in the Ukrainian situation, what you have visually is mostly women and children coming across the border, whereas some of the southern border was a bit more mixed, right? We had young men who were escaping efforts by gangs, for example, to threaten families and force them into drug trafficking, or you had environmental impact situation where you have the dry corridor where people basically can't live and they make their way northward trying to find new employment. So it was a mixed bag in the southern border. And the general response to it was, well, that's not really our problem. Why don't you stay home? Right. Very much less sympathetic than what we see now. I mean, we talk about the reasons for that, but there are biases about, people in the Middle East, they always are in war, which is incorrect. Of course, we have, the historical context that explains a wide variety of causes, including U.S. involvement in some of the problems along the southern border. There's this concern about, how many more are coming. But here we are in the Ukrainian situation, and there's a different outlook. The outlook is we better watch out that the Russian aggressor does not go beyond Ukraine, attack European Union or NATO countries, and the people coming across are predominantly mothers with little children or teenagers or women, right? It's a gender perspective too, that
it's women and children basically. Yes, is the situation.
It's the gender piece and the family piece that make Americans more aware of that. But right. Also here in New York, of course, we have a strong Ukrainian American contingency. Right. So they're agitating just like anybody else would for their people. And they're also very successful. Plus, they're Christians. They have connections. I mean, all of these factors play into that.
So let's do the deep dive into the Ukrainian question right now. Right now, in the discussions we've had with folks at the UN, their latest estimate has, as of this recording, 3 million plus displaced or refugees currently either on the move or have exited Ukraine. One would argue this is the largest humanitarian crisis that Europe has seen since World War II. But this has left countries like Poland, this has left, the other NATO allies holding the string on this huge humanitarian crisis. What roles should or do the EU, NATO, and what should the US be doing? And then I want to follow up with that about other NGOs.
Yeah. So one of the issues clearly is about 2 million of those 3 million plus who have been able to cross the border from Ukraine are in Poland, as you mentioned, right?
Right.
A vast number of refugees have arrived in Poland. They have received a very welcoming open door policy, not only in Poland, but they're now able to go anywhere within European Union countries for the next 3 years with work permits, and they can stay there for that time period for now. So they will move through Poland eventually and also to other countries. What we've seen the Polish government do in particular is mobilize its citizenry along with all these Ukrainian Polish citizens and others who have come and said, it is time to step up and pay back for all the support we have received in the past from Ukrainians. So they're putting them up in homes. It's not like all of the Ukrainians that are coming across the border are put into refugee homes, like we often have seen in prior
large mass housing tents,
exactly,
etc., like what we see.
Converted barracks or schools or those kinds of things, right? No, that's not happening because there's a lot of sympathy for this particular group of refugees, women and children, and also familiar in terms of cultural and religious practices. It's easier for people to sort of say, come into my home. They're more open.
Let me jump on that for a real quick second. We saw recently the British government, the Crown just announced that they are giving £350 sterling to families who are housing Ukrainian refugees. Mm-hmm. This is something we didn't see during the Afghan withdrawal. Is it because Ukrainians can integrate better with Western families than, let's say, Afghan families in this instance? Is that a factor?
So this is a really interesting question. So on my campus at Siena College, we have a program that's called ECAR, ECAR, Every Campus a Refuge, and we are hosting an Afghan interpreter with his wife and child.
Oh, so wow.
They're living on our campus. They're participating in all campus activities. We are, a Catholic Franciscan college, so it didn't matter to us. We just believe strongly that we ought to pay back an Afghan interpreter and his family, right? Because they sacrificed a lot for us. They're lovely people. They have gatherings with students to educate our students. They have meals with our students. They go out with our students to see a movie, whatever it is, right? They are fully integrated. I don't think it is a matter of, being easier integrated or not. It is a matter of people being willing to actually take a step towards people with a different cultural background, a different religious background, without maybe knowing them,
When we have these discussions, we talk about Red Cross, Red Crescent. Mm-hmm. We talk about the UN High Commission on Refugees.
Right.
Is this a point, or should this be a milestone where the U.S. either brings out the A game, or has the U.S. ever really had an A game in this type of situation?
So one of the huge problems in the U.S. is that during the last administration, we had massive cutbacks on nonprofits, anyone who worked within social service areas, right? And now we have practically 100,000 Afghans in the pipeline, right? That have not yet received the proper paperwork. They also were brought here on humanitarian parole, which is sort of an in-between standing. What are you going to do? Send them back in a year? That's not going to happen. The Taliban is in charge, right? So we have to process all of these people for paperwork. And our system is so bogged down that we have not even yet decided to allow Ukrainians to come here, right?
Right.
Which is a bit upsetting to a lot of Ukrainian Americans, of course, because they're saying, well, let's move on this issue. We allowed Ukrainians to come between 2018 and 2020 before COVID, and actually they made up 14% of all refugees that arrived at that time period. So we have a strong contingency of Ukrainians as refugees who are working now and integrated in the United States. We need to do the same again, but as I said, the system is so bogged down with prior arrivals that were a bit chaotic that we have to invest some serious money into them.
But allow me, if you will, Vera, to play kind of a devil's advocate here.
Okay.
Is it fair that the U.S. should hold the burden? I mean, because when traditionally, what we saw in Afghanistan, what we saw in the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon, in Lebanon even, Libya, Yemen, even Syria. Mm-hmm. Everybody kind of looks at, okay, you know what? You've got wide open spaces out there in the U.S., tons of money. Mm-hmm. You guys deal with it. We'll kind of be a halfway house. Is it fair to have that weight on the U.S. shoulders solely, or is that a misconception?
That's a misconception. If you might recall, I'm a citizen of Germany, right? So I'm a German. My family, I can speak to that later, was actually suffering under the Soviet occupation of East Germany. So I have a particular insight on what that means to be under Soviet control or Russian control. But anyway, so Germany, if you might recall, took over under Angela Merkel, took over 1 million Syrians in, right? That is a number far beyond anything that the US ever accepted on Syrians, on Iraqis, on, in terms of the Middle Eastern, fallout from those wars. Now this time it is Poland's turn, of course, to take their neighbors predominantly, but it's also the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Slovenes, the Moldovans are mostly sending their people through because they're a little nervous about if they're next on the list for Putin,
Right.
So people don't really want to stay there, but it really is a burden of the European Union, and that's where people should predominantly be. And the European Union will pay for those 3 million plus refugees and put them up and place them with families and connect them with their relatives and pay for that. I mean, Poland asked for funding from the European Union because it is a heavy burden on Poland with over 2 million. So it's not that they're coming to the US, but what we have to remember is, so I want to tell you a little twist to my to the Afghan family that we're hosting on campus, right?
Please.
So he has a former Ukrainian refugee caseworker. She arrived as a refugee, 5-6 years ago. Now she works as a caseworker for other refugees. Her dad is fighting the Russians. So.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
The caseworker at the ECAR program at Siena is a Ukrainian national whose father is now currently fighting Russians.
So it's we hosting the Afghan,
right.
And we have a resettlement agency called USCRI, and they have caseworkers. And so this is a young Ukrainian woman, and
really?
She helps other refugees as a full-time job, right? That's her job, to bring them in and teach them do paperwork and teach them what has to happen. And now her dad is fighting for Ukraine. So if her dad is injured or her dad can come out at some point, I think the United States ought to accept him because his daughter works here and lives here, right? So it depends on where Ukrainians live. That's where people should go. We shouldn't separate families.
But let me ask the ugly questions here, Vera. Are we riding too tight a rope here when we look at taking in, how much refugees can we take in? We're looking at economic pressures on inflation, prices of gas, prices of food, supply chain problems, all of these impacts. Is it? I'm trying to think of the right way to ask this question. Go ahead, Vera. I think you know where I'm going with it.
I want to help you out because I'm going to give you a really good answer.
Okay.
Because here in upstate New York, cities like Albany, Troy, Schenectady, Binghamton, Utica, they have suffered from young people departing the area. And we are short of workers. And those cities have applied for refugees to come to our areas because we know from involvement with various groups that within, for example, among the Afghans, within a year of arrival here, they're off all social service programs. They're self-sufficient and they start businesses, they start restaurants, they start catering jobs, they are mechanics, whatever job you can find is covered here in this area by fairly recently arriving refugees. And we have such a gap in terms of who we can hire for certain jobs that are entrepreneurial, that create energy in our communities, that most of the arrivals actually thrive within a few years. So the conception that refugees are always an economic burden is actually incorrect. We are desperate for people to come to our areas and work in industry, in various sectors. So they have really helped us.
That is great perspective, Vera. And I think that that's a message that really needs to be broadcast, not only to, the local and state governments, but I think, the federal government here in Washington, I think needs to hear about that as well. A few more questions in the time we have left. I want to ask, in your eyes, how bad or how dire is the humanitarian situation with the current state of the Ukrainian situation?
I would classify the Russian warfare as savage and barbaric, to be honest, because what they're doing is they're trying to encircle cities, especially places like Kharkiv and Mariupol, because they want to punish those people for resisting, for being anti-Russian language, and they're basically committing war crimes there.
Okay, so I just want to ask this direct question then. In your legal opinion, are the actions of the Russian military and Vladimir Putin, are they in fact war crimes in your eyes, in your legal opinion?
So I'm not a practicing human rights lawyer, but in my perspective and in my conversations with lawyers active in the field, they're all saying there are certain bits of evidence they will look at in detail. The use of cluster bombs, which has now been proven. Mykolaiv, I think, is the city where the cluster bombs were used by the Russians. They have evidence for that. That is illegal weapons use and documented. The other issue is that there is systematic targeting of civilians. We see that by, civilian infrastructure and individuals. We see that the humanitarian corridors are bombed by the Russians. They have not allowed groups of people to leave safely. So that is a war crime. In addition to the systematic targeting of hospitals, any kind of structures that are marked as needing protection, like what we're waiting to hear right now, the theater that was bombed that served as a
refuge, shelter.
As a refuge, and we're not sure. We hear possibly 1,000 to 1,300 people may have been hiding, mostly women, children, elderly, maybe disabled. And the fact alone that the building was marked, that this was a civilian area, that there were children in there, and the Russians bombed, that is a war crime.
Let me ask you a deeper, darker question.
Yeah.
In your experience, does this border on genocide?
No, genocide is something entirely different. Genocide is something where you systematically go after a people because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, and you arrest them all and you murder them all. You wouldn't allow anybody to leave.
Could it not be argued that what we are seeing the Russian government and the Russian military do in the targeting of civilian apartment blocks, the refuge that was sought in a theater in a downtown, the violation of various international laws on the targeting of civilians, does this not look like what we've seen in past history as far as him targeting and wanting to wipe out the Ukrainians in response for not playing nice in the sandbox?
No, because there's no systematic effort to just target Ukrainians.
Okay.
Anyone in the city of Mariupol will die. If you're an international student and remained and couldn't get out, if you're Russian speaking and you want to stay in your city and you're not supportive of Putin and you're ethnically Russian, ethnic Russians also get killed there because they stayed. Anyone who stays or stayed or now remains is seen by Putin as the enemy, because if you haven't escaped earlier, you must be a resistor. If you're a child, a woman, an elderly, if you're Russian speaking, Ukrainian, it doesn't matter. You're the enemy now. right?
This is just all out. This is just plain civilian attacks, civilian murder.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So it's
fair enough.
mass murder. It's mass murder through heavy weaponry, and it is a war crime.
How much of an impact is this going to have short-term future and long-term future? Because, I was talking to a friend of mine in the international NGO community, and they were saying the concern that we have is that the impact of having, like, as you had mentioned before, the EU program to allow Ukrainian refugees to work visa in the EU, is the fear is that, number one, families are being separated. They may not return to the Ukraine, number two, and that the long-term effect of this refugee crisis is the fact that this may have dismantled Ukraine as we know it. Is that fair?
I think there's a huge potential issue in the fact that men remain and women and children are gone. So in other words, families are separated, and to be absolutely honest, out of 10 refugees, at best 3 ever return to their country under general circumstances, meaning that most of the Ukrainians who have left may never be able to return, depending on how much destruction there is in the country, if there is some agreement with Putin to sort of give him a chunk to stop him from killing massive amounts of civilians. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I don't know how a country can thrive when vast numbers of women and children are gone, right? So this is the disruptive fact that will last a decade at least. I mean, Ukrainians say we will fight. Ukrainians say we will rebuild. We will not give up. That all might be true, but Ukrainians will not sort of be able to rebuild quickly and return to their homeland and return to what remains of their towns and cities, especially in the southern and more eastern and northern parts of the country. I mean, this is long-term devastation.
So let me just ask the quick lightning round type question. Can Ukraine survive this? The Ukrainian culture survive this? And how much of a long-term impact is this situation going to have?
So Ukrainians will survive it because, number one, they're very dedicated to their homeland. And as you see, they volunteer to return or they volunteer to stay and struggle against the overwhelming Russian forces. With maybe US and European support, they might be able to hold back or even push back Russian forces from certain areas. Culturally, Ukrainians are very strong. They have their language, they have their customs, their food, their folkloric traditions that will not be taken from them because many of them live in Poland and have lived in Germany and live in the United States. And they gather regularly, and their young people are proud of that origin and of their history. So it is practically impossible to erase a people if they live in the diaspora or they live in many countries outside of their homeland, because they're willing to put a lot of effort into making their culture survive. So I don't see that being a reality at all. I think Ukrainians will survive, Ukrainians will thrive, they will rebuild. This is a horrible moment in their lives, in their existence, but I think they will recover.
Well, we hope so. And obviously, yes. As I'm sure everybody up on campus there in Siena, as does everybody, mostly around the world, where all our hearts go out to the Ukrainian people, and we all hope and pray for peace on this. Vera, your expertise is amazing on this. Thank you so much for joining us on Message Traffic. I hope we can have you back again as this situation develops, either for the positive or for the negative.
Absolutely, I'd love to. So take good care.
We will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.